Imagine standing on the edge of the white cliffs of Dover, looking out across a narrow strip of gray, churning water toward mainland Europe. Today, it feels like a barrier, a moat separating a fiercely independent island from the rest of the world. But for thousands of years, this island was not an island at all, and its story is one of the most paradoxical in human history. We are looking at a rainy, wind-swept rock anchored in the North Atlantic that somehow grew up to dictate the fate of a quarter of the human population. How does a place so isolated, so geographically disadvantaged in the ancient world, become the architect of the modern global age? What most people overlook is that the United Kingdom was not born out of a grand design or a shared destiny. It was forged in the fires of repeated invasions, brutal internal betrayals, and existential terrors. Unity built the nation, but it also nearly destroyed it. It is a story of how a collection of warring tribes became a global empire, only to find themselves, once again, questioning who they really are. This is not just a history of kings and battles. It is the story of how power reshapes identity itself. To truly understand this place, we have to look at the ground beneath our feet. Geography is destiny, and for the British Isles, geography was a fickle god. 10,000 years ago, you could have walked from modern-day France to England across a vast, fertile plain known as Doggerland. But as the Ice Age ended and ocean levels rose, the sea rushed in, creating the English Channel. Suddenly, the people living here were cut off. This created a profound psychological contradiction that still exists today. The sea was their greatest protector, but also their greatest prison. What helped also weakened? The same waters that guarded them against massive land armies also meant that when invaders did break through, the defenders had nowhere to run. The terrain itself divided the people. The south and east were rolling, fertile lowlands, perfect for agriculture and open to European influence. The north and west were rugged, mountainous, and fiercely resistant to control. Geography dictated that this would never be an easy place to unite. What's interesting here is that the climate, notoriously damp and unpredictable, forced a culture of intense adaptability and resilience. You could not rely on the weather. You had to rely on your own ingenuity and stockpiled resources. But let's go back even further, to a time before nations, before written words. Imagine standing in the Salisbury Plain around 2500 BC. The air is thick with the smell of grease, sweat, and turned earth. You are watching hundreds of people, your neighbors, straining against thick leather ropes, dragging a 30-ton sarsen stone across wooden rollers. Why? Why expend such monumental effort to align giant stones with the midwinter sun? These Neolithic people were not just building a monument, they were anchoring their souls to the land. This was an era of profound transition from wandering hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. Life was brutal and short, but in building Stonehenge, they were making a statement that they belonged to this soil. It's hard to say if they felt a sense of shared identity across the island, but they certainly shared a common struggle against a harsh environment. As the centuries rolled on, bronze and iron replaced stone, and a patchwork of Celtic tribes spread across the hills, living in fortified hill forts, constantly raiding one another, practicing a druidic religion that terrified the outside world. They were a people deeply connected to nature, fiercely independent, and utterly unprepared for the machine that was about to crush them. In 43 AD, that machine arrived in the form of the Roman Empire. The Romans didn't and oppose, just invade. They engineered a new reality. They brought straight roads, paved cities, heated baths, and a brutal, calculating bureaucracy. For the first time, a large portion of the island was forced into a single political system. But power in the Roman era was never about consensus, it was about absolute dominance. Many resisted, most famously Queen Boudica of the Iceni, who led a bloody revolt that burned London to the ground before being ruthlessly crushed. This shows a fundamental psychological truth about the birth of the British identity. Power formed through trauma. People obeyed because the alternative was annihilation. Yet, after nearly 4 centuries of rule, the Roman Empire began to rot from the inside. In 410 AD, as barbarian hordes pressed on Rome, the emperor sent a letter to Britain telling the inhabitants to look to their own defenses. Just like that, the legions marched away, leaving behind a population that had forgotten how to govern and defend itself. The cities crumbled, The roads grew over with weeds, and darkness fell. But here's the problem. This system was already breaking, and no one could stop what came next. With the Romans gone, the island was vulnerable, and waves of Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, poured across the North Sea. This was not just a war. It was survival. They pushed the native Celtic populations into the fringes of Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland, establishing competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For centuries, Britain was a fractured, bleeding landscape of warlords. Then came the Vikings. Sailing in their terrifying longships, they pillaged monasteries and conquered kingdom after kingdom until only one remained. Wessex, ruled by a desperate king named Alfred. Alfred didn't just fight the Vikings. He used the threat of total annihilation to forge the very idea of England. He established fortified towns, built a navy, and promoted a common English language. By the time his successors unified the country, a distinct English identity had emerged from the mud and blood of the Viking Wars. But this hard-won unity was incredibly fragile, resting on the shoulders of whoever wore the crown. And that fragility shattered violently in 1066. Picture the scene at the Battle of Hastings. Anglo-Saxon King Harold, exhausted from fighting off a Viking invasion in the north, standing on a ridge, his shield wall holding desperately against the cavalry charges of William, Duke of Normandy. Then, the arrow strikes Harold and Appos. SI. The shield wall collapses, and the course of British history is altered forever. The Norman conquest was an existential crisis of the highest order. William the Conqueror didn't end Appos. He just take the throne. He replaced the entire ruling class. He built massive stone castles across the landscape, physical reminders to the conquered English of who was now in charge. French became the language of the elite, while English was relegated to the peasants. This was a masterclass in psychological domination. But from this brutal subjugation, something unexpected happened. To keep his own rebellious barons in check and to govern effectively, King John was forced by his nobles in 1215 to sign the Magna Carta. This document established that even the king was not above the law. What looked like strength was already decay, as absolute royal power began its centuries-long retreat. Then came the Great Mortality. In 1348, ships carrying the Black Death docked in southern England. Within months, a third to a half of the entire population was dead. The smell of decaying flesh hung heavy over deserted villages. But this horrific tragedy did the unthinkable. It destroyed the feudal system. With so few peasants left alive to work the land, those who survived suddenly had leverage. They demanded higher wages and freedom of movement. The psychological shift was monumental. Common people realized that a king's blood spilled and curdled just as easily as a peasant's. This newfound economic freedom paved the way for the rise of a merchant class and set the stage for the religious and political upheavals of the Tudor and Stuart eras. Henry VIII broke with Rome, not out of deep theological conviction, but because he needed an heir and absolute control. This split with the Catholic Church isolated England from Catholic Europe, but ignited a fierce, Protestant national identity that would fuel its expansion. By the 17th century, the tension between the crown and parliament erupted into a bloody civil war. King Charles I believed in the divine right of kings, but parliament held the purse strings. Brother fought brother in a conflict that ended with the shocking, public execution of the king in 1649. This was the ultimate paradox. The nation killed its sovereign to protect its liberty, only to fall under the puritanical military dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. They eventually restored the monarchy, but power had shifted permanently. By 1707, the Acts of Union officially joined England and Scotland, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. It was a marriage of convenience, driven by economic necessity and a mutual fear of France, but it created the framework for global dominance. Nowhere is the messy, painful transformation of the nation more visible than in the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. Britain possessed vast reserves of coal and an empire that provided raw materials and captive markets. But the cost of this progress was paid in human misery. Imagine a 10-year-old child in 1840, covered in soot, crawling through a narrow, dark tunnel in a coal mine for 14 hours a day, just to keep the steam engines of Manchester humming. The green, agrarian landscape was swallowed by dark, satanic mills. Cities exploded in size, filled with cholera, poverty, and crushing labor. Yet, this brutal machine propelled Britain to the apex of global power. During the Victorian era, the British Empire covered a quarter of the globe. They believed they were bringing civilization to the world, but this was often a thin veil for ruthless economic exploitation. Maybe this wasn't Apos, strength at all, but a frantic, unsustainable overreach driven by capitalistic greed. This massive empire was tested to destruction in the 20th century. Two catastrophic world wars drained the nation and Apos' wealth and youth. During the Blitz of 1940, as German bombs rained down on London, civilians slept in subway stations, their homes reduced to rubble above them. This was another moment of pure survival, and it forged a new post-war social contract. The empire was dismantled, but at home, the government created the National Health Service and a comprehensive welfare state. The focus shifted from global dominance to internal societal health. The transition was painful, marked by economic stagnation in the 1970s and the loss of traditional heavy industries, leaving many working-class communities devastated. Today, the United Kingdom finds itself at another crossroads, still wrestling with the ghosts of its past. Its global role is no longer defined by naval supremacy, but by soft power, its language, its music, its finance, and its culture. Yet, the ancient fault lines remain. The tension between the central government in London and the nations of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is as palpable as it was centuries ago. But this is where things get complicated. The decision to leave the European Union in the 21st century exposed deep divides regarding identity, reflecting that age-old tension between wanting to be an island fortress and needing to be a global merchant. So maybe this was never just about survival, but about how power reshapes identity itself. We look at the grand sweep of British history and see a continuous struggle to balance isolation with engagement, liberty with control, and unity with diversity. And if history has taught us anything on this rainy, windswept rock, it's that nations don't fall when they are weak, but when they believe they cannot change. As the tides continue to crash against the white cliffs of Dover, one must wonder, in a rapidly changing world, what will the next reinvention of this island look like?